Hello and welcome to today's class. My name is Grace Greger and today we are going to discuss how, using the redundancy principle, the signaling principle, and the spatial contiguity principle can help reduce extraneous load in a student's working memory. So, in other words, how to reduce information overload. So let's begin. According to Richard Mayer, the redundancy principle states that we can learn so much more through just graphics and narration than we can from graphics, narration, and on-screen information combined. It is very important that we as educators do not overload our students' channels, both auditory and visual. When we're throwing a lot of information at them, it can be very overwhelming with all the online pictures, and then we are talking on top of that, and they are reading the same text that we are speaking all at the same time. Redundancy goes hand in hand with the information store principle and the extraneous processing and extraneous load principles. So basically, if we're throwing all this information at our students, the information that is not important, the information that the professor just keeps repeating and going on and on and on and on about, needs to be eliminated. Take it out. Keep only what is absolutely necessary for the student to learn what you are trying to teach them. In the real world, everyday life, redundancy can happen anywhere and at any time. For example, take the picture of this book that I used to read my daughter. I used to read this to my daughter all the time, but I never really realized that I was being redundant. By me reading the words of the book out loud to her, and then having the words on each page of the book, and my daughter also internally reading, because she could read at that time, I was being redundant with her, and I was overloading her working memory. Redundancy also happens in the classroom all the time. For example, I find myself repeating myself over and over and over and over again for a couple of reasons. One, half the time I'm not sure if my students are listening to me. If it's really early in the morning, first period, or at the end of the day, 7th, 8th period, my students, they're in a whole different frame of mind. So I'm hoping that by repeating myself, then what I'm saying will stick with them. Or every single class, there's that one student who will ask the question you literally just got done answering. It's so frustrating. So as educators, I think we tend to just repeat ourselves over and over and over, hoping that at least the students will hear us once or twice and the information will stick. However, according to the redundancy principle, we are actually overloading our students' working memory, and therefore they are not actually learning the information that we want them to learn. Here is a really good example of an educator being redundant in the classroom in a different way. In this picture, you see the educator has a picture that they're showing the students, the information in typed words with the picture, and then the educator is reading the words on the picture out loud. The students are not getting the information because it is redundant and it's overloading the working memory. In the other picture, the second picture, you see the educator just has the picture posted, and then they are just narrating everything they want the students to know. So the students do not have to waste the time also reading the information on the board at the same time. This second picture is a good example of how to reduce redundancy in the classroom. The signaling principle brings attention to the fact that we learn more deeply when our attention is brought to the most important information of a multimedia message. Therefore, in order to signal to the students that this is the most important information you need to know, we use cues. Cues reduce the extraneous load, and therefore the student's working load is not as overwhelmed, and deeper, meaningful learning can take place. By cueing our students to the information that is most important, we reduce the extraneous cognitive load and therefore help working memory. We help the working memory to organize the most important information and sort it and then link it to information already in long-term memory. Thus, by signaling and cueing our students to the most important information, we are actually helping our students learn more. In our daily lives, we are being cued constantly. We have so many signals coming at us all the time. Where to look, where to focus our attention on. For example, here is a picture that you could encounter anywhere public and even in private locations as well. This sign represents the fact that only women can use this bathroom. So this signal or this cue in the form of a sign helps everyone know who is technically allowed in this restroom and who technically is not. In order to help alleviate the extraneous processing and extraneous load on our students' working memory, we can use cueing such as highlighting, circling, pointing, and just even using different tones of voice or intonation. For example, saying something louder, putting more emphasis on a word, and at times speaking quieter. These cues grabs our students' attention to, hey, this is something different and this is something important that I need to pay attention to. According to Mayer, the Spatial Contiguity Principle states that people learn better if words and pictures are placed closer together rather than far apart. So essentially, if students have to keep flipping back and forth between the words and the actual picture, it is going to overload their working memory. Spatial contiguity, the environmental organizing and linking principle, and an extraneous processing are all interconnected. Essentially, if students are constantly wasting time flipping between two sources of information that should be linked together, for example, pictures and the text that goes with the pictures, the working memory is overloaded and the new information is not learned. Instead, the student just becomes frustrated. However, research in our textbook shows that when pictures and text are placed closer together, the student's working memory is not overloaded as much, and therefore the working memory can take in the new information better, it can organize it, and integrate it into long-term memory. Thus, the new information is being learned. As educators, we can greatly reduce the spatial contiguity for our students. In order to do that, we just have to place our words and pictures together. Here's an example of spatial contiguity that's occurred rather recently with my learning experience. This picture is from page 284 of our textbook for this class. On this page, Mayer is talking about an example of lightning. I'm sure the example is wonderful. However, he is referring to an example written clear back in chapter 3. But I'm supposed to be reading chapter 12. So, therefore, I do not want to flip hundreds of pages to see what in the world he is talking about in order to make what I'm reading at that moment make sense. And in my classroom, my students would not want to flip back and forth either. So, in order to reduce the spatial contiguity, Mayer would have done a lot better for all of us reading this book if he had actually included the examples in the same chapter he wrote about them. This next picture we are going to look at is an excellent example of how we as educators can reduce the spatial contiguity in our classrooms. This picture shows a beautiful picture of a flower and its working parts. By including the text with each part, the learner is able to absorb the information so much easier and thus reducing their working memory. If the picture and the words had been spread apart, the learner would have been forced to flip back and forth, and therefore the learning would have taken extra time and the learner may have actually gotten confused. But again, with everything placed together, that extraneous load, extraneous processing is taken off the learner's working memory. It is reduced, and then the new information can be integrated into long-term memory more efficiently. Let's recap what we have already gone over today. The redundancy principle just means that we are overloading the visual and the auditory channels of learning. So in order to reduce redundancy, we need to focus on two areas. One visual, a picture, and one auditory, narration. The signaling principle uses cues to draw the student's attention to the most important information. That is what we want the students to learn at that point. This cueing reduces all of the extra information the student does not need, and therefore the student's extraneous load and extraneous processing is reduced. The spatial contiguity means that when we educators are providing our students with new information in multimedia forms, we are placing text and the corresponding pictures close together. By attending to all three of these, the redundancy principle, the signaling principle, and the spatial contiguity principle, we are able to reduce extraneous load, extraneous processing, which in turn reduces the amount of working memory that has to be involved in learning, and that reduction frees up the long-term memory to be able to integrate the new learning quicker. Thank you for attending today's lesson on how we can use the redundancy principle, the signaling principle, and the spatial contiguity principle to reduce cognitive load on our students' working memory. You guys have a great week, and I will see you next time.